Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. I'm excited to talk to you today a little bit about what we are doing here at the Wegman School of Pharmacy in terms of helping students understand and reflect on their own learning. So one of the ways in which we do this is through our longitudinal reports in ExamSoft. So that's what I'll talk to you mostly about today because we want to make sure that when our students use these, they're actually getting something out of the process. So I will start just by talking very briefly about how we're using longitudinal reports at the level of faculty and administration at the school, just to kind of put it in context in terms of how we use this internally and then how we use these with our students. But the bulk of the presentation will really be about the students. So why should our students be running longitudinal reports? How can they approach looking at their own assessment data? And how do we get students to be interested and buy into this process and get the most out of it? And really, when we do this, we have two goals in mind. The first is that we want students to get the most relevant information from their from ExamSoft and from their longitudinal reports. But we also want to give them tools that will help them better understand and benefit from the information. We don't want them to just look at a report and see a bunch of numbers and not really care what they mean. We want them to improve by knowing this information and give them the opportunity to self-assess and self-reflect a little bit. So when we look at the capabilities of ExamSoft and the longitudinal reports, we have different levels of analysis that can occur. Usually when a faculty member or a member of the administration is looking at longitudinal reports, they're looking at reports in aggregate of all of the student data. And they can look at the analysis of the entire curriculum, the analysis of specific courses or all courses or course sequences. They can look at analysis of different categories of mapping, whether they may be accreditation standards or topics or Bloom's taxonomy. And that's what we usually find ourselves doing. Usually those that are assessing the entire curriculum would be deans, assessment groups, the curriculum group. They're looking at how well we're covering different areas and how well the students are performing. But individual faculty are doing this a lot too. So you might have a course coordinator, a department chair, or an individual instructor looking at the longitudinal analysis of their course, or even a sequence of courses that may be linked in the curriculum. But there's a lot of power in analyzing the individual student longitudinal report, and I think that it's often overlooked because there's so much data that can be gleaned from these curriculum-wide or course-wide longitudinal reports that we sometimes forget that there's a specific individual student behind each of those data points. And it's really important for us to sometimes take a step away from the aggregate data and look at each individual student's performance and see how that can help us. So in the faculty and administration level, you might have an academic progression committee who has identified students who are struggling in the program and wants to look at their longitudinal reports. At our school, advisors look at these to make sure that their students are on track. But what we're focusing on today is the ability of the student to access their own performance in all of their courses or some of their courses to better help them learn and understand the material. I promised that we would briefly look at the use of longitudinal reports for faculty and administration. So this page here probably looks familiar to all or many of you, where we can go into the longitudinal analysis under reports and start to filter for the information that we want. Filter by date, by users here, which would be the individual exam creators or question creators, and decide what courses we want to look at. We can then, in our secondary filter, look at the types of different assessments, whether it be quizzes or exams or rubrics, for example. and choose whether we want to look at all of our categories that we map to, or maybe just some of them. And so we can use this in lots of different ways. One example of something we've been doing here at Wegman School of Pharmacy is starting to look at a course level analysis using this so that we can monitor how well we're teaching in our courses and how well we're covering each of the course learning outcomes in that course. So I'm showing you here an example of one of our pharmacology courses that our pharmacy students take, and we have 5 learning outcomes in that course. And so when we run these longitudinal analyses, we can ask the question of, all right, if we have these 5 learning outcomes, are we covering them equally? Is there one that we, kind of dropped the ball and aren't covering it all, which you can kind of see in our green sliver here with learning outcome 3. But this is just providing of all of the assessment questions that we asked in this semester, how do they break up by learning outcome? So learning outcomes 1, 2, 4, and 5 have a good amount of coverage in the course. And then again, here we see this learning outcome 3, and only 5% of our questions actually map to that. So that identified for us maybe an area where we wanted to make improvements in the course. It is a learning outcome that doesn't get as much emphasis, and we don't want it to be equal to the others, but 5% was a little bit lower than we had expected. But this also allows for us to look at the performance. So the chart on the right-hand side looks at the percent correct for the items in each one of these that are mapped to each one of these learning outcomes. And so when we look at that, we're kind of right on target. We aim in our program to have averages of about 85%. We are a professional program where our outcomes are clearly defined and measured, so we want that high performance. And so we see here that we're right about on target for all of them. But what this longitudinal analysis allowed us to do was not just look at the performance, but also looked at how well we were teaching our course and how well we were covering our outcomes. So that's just one example of the many ways in which faculty and administrators can use these longitudinal reports. But we're here today to talk about the students. So students can run their own longitudinal reports. They can get longitudinal reports from faculty members. But overall, it allows for students to monitor their performance, but also reflect on their performance. So if there are areas in which they are not doing as well as others, they can see those numbers. They can check it over time to see if they're improving, but they can also reflect and say to themselves, why is this number low, and what can I do to improve it? And they can monitor this in the same ways that the faculty members do. So this list is the same one that you saw just a couple minutes ago. So they can look at their individual performance on the entire curriculum, whether it be in the courses or by other types of categories. So again, Bloom's taxonomy, perhaps their accreditation standards and things like that. They can look at their performance longitudinally in a course sequence, or they can just take a snapshot of an individual course. And what I'll try and do today is to look at each of these and how students can benefit from looking at each of these, both when they're doing well and when they're having troubles in the curriculum. Why is this important? We wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't important. And we always want to say that we're doing it for the students, and it's important because we want our students to be successful and self-reflective in the process. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that most of us are evaluated from our accreditors based on a certain set of standards. So number one reason always is we want our students to be successful, but it just is an added component to this that our accreditors tell us we have to teach certain things, and we have to teach our students to be self-reflective and to monitor their success. So in pharmacy education, our standards are the ACPE accreditation standards. And if any of you out there are from a pharmacy school, you know this bane of our existence, which is standard 4. Not the bane of our existence because we don't want to teach it, more because it's very difficult to assess and to incorporate into very science-heavy courses. So the standard 4 in our standards is all about personal and professional development. So we're required that our students examine and reflect upon knowledge, skills, and abilities that can enhance or limit their professional or personal growth. We also have to have our students engage in innovative activities by using creative thinking to envision better ways of accomplishing professional goals. And so if you reflect on those couple of statements for just a minute, all of that is hit upon when we have our students create and evaluate and reflect on their longitudinal reports from, again, the curriculum or courses or course sequences. If you're outside of the world of pharmacy, these might look familiar to you. Our larger accrediting body for our whole institution is Middle States, and if you're not accredited by Middle States, there's a good chance you're accredited by somebody else. These standards tend to be broader, less specific, but they still require us to have levels of student support, learning opportunities, and programs that help promote students' academic progress. So although they are a little bit less specific, the longitudinal reports still fit in this category, and when we're having our students do these reports, we are satisfying some of those accreditation standards, in addition, of course, to helping them succeed. The benefits are really trifold to our students. The most obvious one is the academic benefit. If they identify areas where they are weak in the curriculum, they can make plans to improve upon that, get better scores in the long run. But that, in turn, is going to help their professional and personal success, not just having maybe graduated from the program with a GPA that's a little bit higher, but all that self-reflection, whether they recognize it or not, is going to better prepare them for all of the self-reflection and assessment that's going to occur after they graduate. So our students are going to get these skills. It's going to help encourage lifelong learning, improve their grades, and help with their personal and professional skills. So we really see this as a well-rounded approach to student success. If we get into the nitty-gritty of this, we really have two options for these longitudinal reports. The first are student-generated reports, and the students have the ability to go in and generate their own. And then we have faculty-generated reports. And I will talk about both of those today. They both have their benefits and strengths, but we'll see that sometimes one of these options will be better than the other. Just very briefly to introduce the two topics, student-generated reports puts a nice amount of personal responsibility on the students that they're required to go in, look at these reports, and reflect on them. They're very user-friendly, as we'll see. The students can kind of get an idea of what's going on without much effort. But if we look at these faculty-generated, they give you the ability to have more comprehensive information and allow you to specifically tailor it to the needs of the students. So just based on those, you might be able to infer some ways in which one might be more beneficial than another in a certain circumstance. They both have their limitations as well, so the student-generated reports don't always tell you the whole picture, as we'll see in just a minute. But of course, the faculty-generated ones require faculty time. The faculty have to go in and actually run these reports, which if it's just one or two students, really is not that time-consuming at all. But if they were doing this on a curriculum-wide basis, would take quite a bit more time. So what I'll do now is go through each of these. We'll start with the student-generated reports, talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses and when it might be beneficial. And then we'll do the same for faculty-generated reports. So our student-generated reports. So not everybody gets to see this view of ExamSoft. I think one of my students who I conned into coming into my office and logging in so that I could pull up some screenshots here to show everybody what this looked like. But it does look similar to what we see as faculty and administrators. So a student can go into ExamSoft, Their choices are a little bit more limited. So they can go to performance analysis. They can pick a date range. So if they want to look at the entire time they've been in the program or just a specific semester, they can choose that. They can also decide if they want to look at all courses that they've taken so far, or if they just want to look at one or two courses or a course sequence. So you can see with this individual, he chose a date range starting when he started the program in August of 2013. He wanted to see everything he's done since that time, and then that populates to a list of all the courses that he's taken in that time, where he would be able to then pick and choose. Once you pick the courses, you can then pick the assessments. Usually the students will want to see the aggregate of all the assessments in whatever courses they chose, but if they wanted to just look at a single assessment, they could do that as well. So that's just highlighting again. So they're picking their date range, the courses that they want, and then the assessments that they want. And so here's that really nice user-friendly interface that the students see when they run a student-generated report. This specific one we're looking at, the student ran a full curriculum report. So every class that he has taken since he started the program. And it looks really nice and allows the students to be able to see what's going on. It does only show you the top categories, so the things that are mapped to most often. The first three are the 3 levels of Bloom's taxonomy that we code to. So every one of our questions will be coded there, so it makes sense that those would rise to the top in terms of most frequently coded to things. Appendix B below that, you see those are our accreditation standards in the School of Pharmacy, and there are all sorts of different topics there related to that. It tells them the number of assessments that mapped to that category and the number of questions that mapped to that category. And then they get to see their average and their peer average. Where they're doing well, it shows green. If they are maybe not performing as well, it will show as yellow. And as we'll see in a little bit, if it's an area of improvement, it will be in red, and there'll be a nice check mark on the right-hand side for improvement areas. So they can very easily look at this, identify areas that are lower than their peers or that are just low in general that they may want to improve upon. But we'll only do that for the most commonly categorized or commonly used categories. This example, like I mentioned, is the full curriculum. They can export that. So this is the table that comes out when they export that data as a PDF file that they can then take with them and look at wherever they would like to. Same information that we saw before on the previous slide. The other option is that maybe they don't want to look at the entire curriculum. Maybe they want to just look at a single course. So this student-generated report is just one course in their curriculum. You can see that those areas of Bloom's taxonomy still show up at the top since all of our questions are mapped to that. But you do see that the student still has a couple areas that are in yellow that may not be an immediate concern, but are a little bit lower overall. But again, allowing for a little bit more of a tailored approach to this longitudinal report, where they are just looking at one or maybe two areas and really focusing in on that. Let's say this student is partway through this course and really wants to see, maybe they have a comprehensive cumulative exam at the end, and they want to see the areas that they need to focus their studying on most to get through that final exam. Maybe they have failed that course and they need to focus on areas for remediation when they need to retake it or remediate certain topics. If we sort this by the performance, here's an example of what shows up for them when they are when there's an area that needs improvement. So at the very bottom of this one course longitudinal report, we have the topic of renal. So the S in that topic stands for system. We also categorize all of our questions based on what system in the body they are from. So renal is one that is tough for a lot of our students. You can see that peer average is only a 75. So we have identified that at a curricular level as an area for improvement. But here this individual student can identify that that is an area of improvement in the topics that were covered in this course. This report has 2 areas for improvement that are checked on the right-hand side because they are well below the peer average, but also close to 70 for us is passing, so those are right on that mark. So really identifying those areas that this student may need improvement. So those are the student-generated reports. So we've seen kind of some of the strengths and weaknesses of that. We'll summarize that after we get through this section. But the faculty-generated reports allow for something just a little bit different, a little bit more tailored to the student, which may be appropriate in certain circumstances. So this is the same type of report that we saw earlier in the presentation, where we're going in through reports and longitudinal analysis. And now we may choose the same filters, depending on, again, what question we're asking. If we're asking the question of how the student is performing on the entire curriculum, we would filter by those criteria. If we just wanted to know a specific course or course sequence, we would do that as well. What's really nice about this, and what is a major difference from the student-generated reports, is first they can filter, or we can filter by the user. So if a student is really struggling with a specific faculty member's questions, we could run a report on just those questions. The other really nice thing about these faculty-generated reports is that we can choose whatever categories we want in this report. If you'll remember, the student-generated report is really, it's just going to give them the most heavily coded to categories, but here we can choose any category, even if there are only a handful of questions in that category. So this is just a screenshot of every major category heading that we map to here in the School of Pharmacy. So Appendix B and D are both our accreditation standards. We map to 3 levels of Bloom's taxonomy. If a question is cumulative, we'll map to that. And then we map to faculty members and the learning outcomes for our course, the body system, and then our own internal School of Pharmacy outcomes. So it seems like a very long list. It is, but it provides us with huge amounts of data, which is great for us. So we can select anything. There have been circumstances where a student wants to see just Bloom's taxonomy. So are they still struggling with those synthesis level questions? Maybe they want a specific body system and they think, I didn't really do well in renal, or I didn't do well in the cardiovascular system, and so I want a very detailed report about that system. So this lets us do that. It lets us really filter in on what specific question do we want to ask about this student's performance. So here's an example of a faculty-generated report for a single student. And the filters that I used here were the full curriculum, all faculty, all courses, and all of the major category headings. This is something that I provide to all of my advisees when they're about to go take their licensing exam at the end of their 4th year of pharmacy school. And I don't want to give them their performance in every teeny subcategory that's available, but I want them to have all of the major headings. So the major headings of our accreditation standards, the major headings of our Bloom's taxonomy and of the body systems. And the feedback that I've gotten from these type of reports is outstanding. The students have a massive amount of information to study to prepare themselves for the NAPLEX, which is our licensing exam, and they don't even really know how to start. And so when I started sending these to our students, I would get feedback within minutes that was, this is the greatest thing. I now know exactly where I need to put my focus for studying for this exam. So very valuable tool for them. You can see from this student, this is a very high-performing student, so there really aren't that many areas of concern This is some of the rest of those major category headings for our body and organ system, as well as Bloom's taxonomy. So you can see the student does really well in all those categories. But again, this is their entire 4 years. What are some of the other things that we can do with this faculty-generated report? Well, here's one thing. So going beyond that single snapshot of the full curriculum, this one student was interested in comparing how well they did in Bloom's taxonomy when they were early second-year students, recognized that they weren't quite where they wanted to be at the end or at the beginning of year 2, wanted to improve. And so looked at this information, reflected on it. We made a plan of how he could practice the higher level thinking, the application and synthesis level questions. And then we ran the same report 2 years later, and you can see huge gains. So a student looked at the report, identified areas that they needed improvement, made a plan, reflected on it, and actually got to see the benefits from this 2 years later. That is a great success story that I love sharing with this student who now is doing a pharmacy residency because he was able to bring his GPA up quite a bit from that second-year snapshot. Well, now let's imagine a student that maybe isn't performing quite as well, and they get this report from me, and they see, a lot of performance in the 90s, a lot in the 80s, but you look at this a little bit closer and see, okay, renal. You've now seen that shows up a number of times in our curriculum with different students. Otolaryngology, not a lot of questions and topics on that, but still performance below what we would hope is the average for our students. And from this report, a student can say, okay, maybe those are the areas that I'm going to study first when I'm preparing for my licensing exam. Or if this was a report from their second year in the program, this is where they're going to start when they study for their final exams. One thing that our curriculum does is it builds a lot upon itself. So students will get an introduction to topics in their first and second year, and then later in their second year and in their third year, they revisit that topic at a higher level and apply it clinically. So if a student recognizes a deficiency in renal, in the kidneys, for example, after they get the introductory material, they know that they have some work to do before they revisit that topic again later in the curriculum. So overall, what are the great uses for these reports? We never want to forget that, that they also identify areas of success. We're very quick to say, let's identify places where you're struggling and need to do better, but that takes on a very negative connotation. So when we do this with our students, we always say, don't just reflect on the areas you're struggling. Reflect on the things that you're doing great on and try and identify what is it about that area that gave you those grades. Is it because you love the topic? Is it because the instructor, you get how that instructor teaches? Is it because you studied harder for that section? What is it that made you do so well there? And that might give you insight into how you can identify areas for focus, which is another important use. It can help improve performance in future courses, but as I had emphasized earlier, and one of the main uses of these for our students is preparing them for those standardized exams that they have to take. If they know going into their studying for that exam the areas that they're strongest and weakest in, it can help set them up for success. And then getting back to those accreditation standards that require us to give our students opportunities to self-reflect and become more self-aware, this definitely hits that. So it helps them both identify and make plans to rectify any weaknesses that they may identify through these reports. If we compare the two, after having gone through them individually, our student-generated reports, they can be run at any time. A student can run one every day of the week if they want. It might not show anything different, but they have free access to that. They can select their courses, all of them or certain courses. They can look at areas of excellence and areas that need improvement very easily. So as a check-in every once in a while. But they only see the categories that are matched to most often. On the other hand, the faculty-generated reports, you can create a fully comprehensive report, or you can tailor it to the specific needs of that student. You have the ability to filter by all courses, certain categories, etc. And it does help create a stronger dialogue between faculty and students because the faculty member sees that report first and then sends it to the student who can also reflect on it. And I'll talk in a few minutes about some of the ways that you can create that dialogue between a faculty member and a student. But if we boil it down to when we should use each of these, the student-generated ones are great for routine check-ins on performance. We have our students routinely run these reports every semester. We call it student success tracking. I can't take any credit for that. Dr. James Sousa and Dr. Richard Obrachta, who are past faculty members here at the School of Pharmacy, created that program. It has been great for us and really was the first time that we were having the students perform these longitudinal reports and reflect on them, and doing it routinely. So like I said, they do it every semester. They run their own report and they reflect on it. But these faculty-generated reports are excellent for that full programmatic review, either at the end of each year or at the end of the entire curriculum as they're preparing for that licensing exam. It's also great during times of academic difficulties. If a student fails an individual course, or if they keep performing poorly on a certain topic, we can create a very specifically tailored review or tailored report for that student moving forward. But the biggest problem that we get, really for any type of new program that we want students to participate in, we always have some challenges with how do we best educate the students on using these reports, and how do we get them to buy into it and not just think of it as another thing that they have to do. The biggest hurdle and the biggest thing to remember is that we cannot expect the students to automatically understand what the reports are or why they're important. We work with these categories every day. We are fully understand the categories, we understand ExamSoft, and we understand what the numbers mean. But the students don't unless you tell them. And my two favorite and most common responses that I get from students when they run these reports, the first is, what does this even mean? They don't understand. They see a bunch of numbers. They're like, what is this B01.01? What does Bloom's taxonomy mean? I don't understand. I'm just going to look at numbers that look high, and I'm going to say, oh, this is good, and I see a number that's low, and I know that's bad. But that's not really reflecting, and that's not really getting the most out of that report. The other common response I get is, I already know my grades. I was in that class. I remember what I got on that exam. I know that I got an A or a B or a C in that course. And so you also have to address, from that perspective, the idea that, yes, a student knows what they got on an exam or in a course, but when you are able to look at it in different ways through different categories, a whole new set of information can be gleaned from that longitudinal type analysis. So here are the things that I have seen and that we've seen at the School of Pharmacy that have helped with educating the students and with buy-in from the students. Absolutely provide them with instructions. We have a sheet that has screenshots of everything they need to do step by step to run the report. So how to run the analysis, we provide them with instructions of when to run it. For us, it is required for them to run it before we give them their registration PIN. So they can't register for their next semester courses until they have not only run this report, but reflected on it and discussed it with their advisor. And so for this, you really do need to utilize the advisor. We tried at the beginning of every year, having a short, brief talk about why we're doing this and what everything means, but very little of that information is retained. And if you count on individual conversations with a faculty member, an advisor, and a student, the students will retain that and will understand. So the first time that I have a first-year student look at these reports, I tell them to bring it in. We go through each of the categories. What is Bloom's taxonomy? What is Appendix B? What are the body systems? What do these numbers mean? How do I identify areas of improvement versus areas of success? And then we talk a little bit about, if you do identify an area of weakness, how you would make a plan to improve there. I always give them examples of the benefits. I give them examples of how our fourth-year students are using them to study for their licensing exam. I give them examples of how they can not just look at their performance in the course, but in a specific topic. And that's really key, because if you have an individual conversation with a student about this, they're much more likely to buy into it than if it was a 10-minute presentation in front of a class, at the beginning of the semester. One thing you have to consider, and the answer to this might be different for different programs, is whether you're going to require it or whether you're going to just encourage it. If you're going to require it, do you give a carrot or do you give a stick? We have decided on the stick approach, where they don't get to register until they complete this, because we have identified it as an essential component of our curriculum that they need to run the reports and reflect on them every semester. But there may be other models, there may be better models, where it is still required, but you don't hold something back from the students. But that will depend on the type of program, the number of students, and how much time the advisors have to talk with students about the reflections. To wrap up, I did want to talk about some considerations if they're going to be regularly utilized in a program, things that we have seen along the way that have been important. The first is that you need to decide on a goal or a purpose. So don't just implement it with no end goal in mind. You want to know, not just for the sake of the faculty and administration involved, but the students that are involved need to know that there's a reason why you're doing this, that it's not just busy work, and that they're actually benefiting. So our goal is that we want to increase self-reflection and increase student performance, all the while meeting our accreditation guidelines. Set a regular schedule. If the students know exactly when they need to complete this, that makes it easy for them. We have decided that once a semester is a good interval. Any closer together than that, and the students will think it is a kind of a burden on them to complete it more often. And the results might not be as meaningful if they're running it more than once a semester. But it might be appropriate to do it once a year in some programs. Try and create a deliverable and a way that they can document actionable items. As I had mentioned, Jane Sousa and Richard Obrakta had developed the student success tracking as a way not just to have the students run the longitudinal report, but it's an actual form in one of our online portfolio programs where the students actually write down what category, their performance, their peers' performance, and then there's a slot for them to comment. And this is then submitted, and the advisor can view that. So that takes it a step beyond just having them look at the report, but actually gives a deliverable item that they must complete that lets them see what has been actionable here, what areas of weakness or what areas of strength are there, and it allows you to go back in time and look at them. So if a student identifies an area of need and then makes a plan to fix it, you probably want to go revisit that maybe the next semester or the next year to see if they've actually improved in that area. As I mentioned, part of the relationship between the advisor and the student requires you to demonstrate the benefit, to give examples of how it has benefited other students, to give example reports so that they understand why it's good for them to do this exercise. You always have to communicate clearly and consistently with the students. So, having reminders every year, making sure that all faculty are involved in the process and invested in the process so that all your advisors are completing this the same way. The last thing that you want to do, or the thing you never want to do, is to tell the students in their first year, we're going to do this every semester, and then never communicate with them about it again. You want a consistent message from not just advisors, but from the administration that this is something that we're always doing, and then it's very important. And finally, you want to monitor your results, right? So we're all about assessment. We want to see what's happening. We want to see how the students are benefiting from this. So don't let everything just kind of go by the wayside, talk about with the students, and never look at it again. You want to monitor the results at the level of individual students, seeing their progress as they go from semester to semester and have identified these areas, but also on the level of the full curriculum. So looking and assessing the benefits of this entire program on your student outcomes and other similar measures. So we always wanted to do that so that we can document the success of a program, or even monitor it in terms of ways that you can improve and identifying areas or things about your program that may need some tweaking before the longitudinal results are fully implemented. So with that, again, I want to thank you for listening into this webinar today. If you have any questions and want to contact me after the fact, my email is up there on the screen. I'm very happy to answer any questions that you might have. And I'll turn it over now to any questions you have right now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation, Melinda. As Melinda stated, we're going to go ahead and open the forum up for a brief Q&A session. So if you do have questions you'd like to pose to Mindy, now would be the time to type them into the GoToWebinar control panel, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen under the questions area. We already have a couple that have come in, Mindy, so we're going to go ahead and dive right in if that's okay.
Sure.
First question is there any way to describe or explain specific outcomes or objectives students see on their report through the system?
So I'm assuming that question refers to more description of what those categories are. There aren't any ways to do that. Really we depend on that student advisor interaction for that. Some of them are self-explanatory. So for those systems, for example, when it comes up with renal or cardiovascular, the student knows what that means. Some of them are not so obvious. So with the Bloom's taxonomy, if the students have never heard of that, there's no way to have a description of that in the actual report. But I think while that might be a nice thing to have, it also encourages more of that interaction, which really makes the program successful when it is, a faculty member or somebody else explaining and describing the category to the student.
Great. Next question is, do all students who access ExamSoft have the capability to do student-generated reports, or does this need to be set by the database administrator?
As far as I know, it is an automatic thing that any student who is in the system, who is using ExamSoft, when they log into ExamSoft, they have the ability to run these reports for themselves.
Great. Next question is the tagging system retroactive in case of continued category structuring or curriculum revision?
Yes, it is, and that's a great thing, a great capability. We just went through a whole process where we wrote new program learning outcomes, or we adopted new program learning outcomes, and so we went through and we had to remove all of the tagging to our past outcomes and re-tag everything to our current outcomes. And since the assessment data is tied to certain questions, if we were to change the mapping of a specific question, it would change and update in a student's longitudinal report as long as they ran a new report. So, so that is a very good thing, especially when the curriculum changes or when accreditation standards change.
Great. Next question is, how are the pie charts done with the faculty-generated reports? Are they generated after downloading data into Excel?
Yes, so that is all. So the faculty, or sorry, the course maps reports. You would download the data, all of the like the pie chart and all that. That was done in Excel with the data that was downloaded. So there isn't at this time a capability in ExamSoft to do those charts for you, although that would be great. But yes, you would have to do a little bit of data analysis outside of the program for that.
Noted. Thanks, Mindy. Next question is, as the students monitor their progress, what is their next course of action once areas for improvement are recognized?
So I will recognize now that that is something that we are working on because it's difficult. So we have, and we're a smaller school, we have about 30 faculty members, and each faculty member has anywhere from 5 to 10 advisees. So the load is pretty low at this point. But we have a lot of variation, and that's something we're hoping to do some professional development on here. But what we see is that some advisors, when they're going through these longitudinal reports with the students, what I do, for example, is the students run their report, they reflect on it, they identify some areas that need improvement and some areas of success, and then I always have them come up with a plan so they have to describe why they think that number was low or why in an area of success they think it was high. And then if the performance was lower, identify a plan for improvement. And that's where this tracking really comes in and having a deliverable. And so as an advisor, before I meet with my student every semester, I go and I look at what they put last time. What action items did they say they were going to do when they last reflected? And I hold them accountable for that. I don't expect them to come up with that plan entirely on their own. Usually that's in our conversation. If they said, well, I'm just going to study harder, usually that leads to a conversation of, well, what do you mean? Are you going to study longer? Or are we going to try and be more efficient with the studying? What do you think it is about that topic that gave you difficulties? So that is all in the relationship building. And right now, not every faculty member at the school is doing that the same way and really monitoring that. It does take time, and we recognize that. So we're kind of working on that now to figure out what's the most efficient way to track that over time, but at the same time is still valuable to the students.
Great. Next question is, what was the process for creating all the categories? Is there some sort of process of review of questions to validate the questions category?
So for our categories, our categories have evolved over time a great deal. It started out that we wanted to look at our accreditation standards because we knew that we were being held accountable for the performance in each of those. And so that was the first one that we had in there. And then shortly after, we added our body systems because we knew that there were certain body systems, disease states, and things like that that we knew we wanted our students to know. We wanted information. All the categories that we map to really have grown out of faculty need. So what do the faculty want to be able to monitor? One of the most recent ones that we've added, or actually a couple of the most recent ones we've added, the first are categories for the learning outcomes for each of our courses. And we did not used to map to that category or have that category even there, but it really was faculty driven. So faculty wanted to start monitoring how well they were covering each of their learning outcomes in the course. So that's what caused us to use those. And at this point, not everybody maps to every learning outcome, but a lot of courses do. We also wanted to start mapping to cumulative questions. So we sprinkle cumulative questions in throughout the entire curriculum, but we want to know a differentiation between questions that are based on new material and then how well our students are retaining that information. So at this point, we don't do a lot of analysis in terms of validating the use of the categories, because for us, we want to have categories for every analysis that a faculty or administration might want to do. And we have the capability with all of our categories to run, probably an infinite number of different types of reports, and we're not doing that at this time, but we have the capability. If anybody ever wanted to look at a super specific category, they would be able to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mindy. Those are all the questions that we have, so we're going to go ahead and wrap things up today. Just a couple of quick reminders. Yes, this webinar has been recorded, so we will be shooting out the link to the recording in the next couple of days, so watch your email boxes for that. Also, as soon as you sign out of the GoToWebinar control panel and leave the webinar, you will get a quick survey that will pop up for you. It's only 5 questions long. We would truly appreciate anybody taking the time to fill those quick survey questions out so we can continue to provide relevant content. Also, if you have questions for Mindy, her email address is on the slide. If you have questions for ExamSoft, you can shoot those over to info@examsoft.com at any time. And remember, we do have a ton of webinars coming up in probably the next 6 weeks. So check out our resources page. That's learn.examsoft.com/resources. We have just a ton coming up, folks. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you again to everybody for taking time out of your day to be with us this afternoon, and thank you.